Hello and greetings to all, and welcome to this virtual launch event of the 2020 Foreign Direct Investment Confidence Index by Kearney's Global Business Policy Council. We've had this event in recent years at the National Press Club, and for obvious reasons, it was implausible for us to do that at the Press Club this year. But we would like to sincerely thank you all for joining us here today. We believe that we have over 35 countries represented on this call, and we'd like to thank you all for joining. I'm Eric Peterson. I'm Managing Director of Kearney's Global Business Policy Council and one of the co-authors of the 2020 Foreign Direct Investments Report. Our one-hour program today will consist of three parts. First, GBPC founder and Kearney Chairman Emeritus Paul Laudacina will summarize the main findings of the report. Paul established the FDICI in 1998 and has not only the historical view, but also will be summarizing this year's findings. Then second, Paul will be joined by two outstanding external experts who I will have the opportunity to introduce momentarily to explore the implications of the results. And third, we will set time aside for your questions. Now, before we begin, I'd like to share a few preliminary procedural details. First of all, this event is on the record and will be available online on the Kearney website immediately after it concludes. In addition, a copy of the final FDICI report will be emailed to you immediately after the conclusion of our event here today. For those of you wishing to join the conversation on social media, please use hashtag FDICI on Twitter and LinkedIn. If you'd like to ask a question, and we'd encourage you please to submit questions, we kindly request that you do so through the chat feature in this WebEx. You'll see the option on your screen, or by reaching out to us directly via email to GBPC, that's Global Business Policy Council, GBPC, at kearney.com. We will collect the questions that have come in and raise them with the various panelists. Please note that we may not have time to accommodate all of the questions that come in. We'll do the best job that we possibly can. So without further ado, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Paul Laudacina, who's mentioned as Chairman Emeritus of Kearney and the founder of the GBPC and the FDICI report, which brings us together here today to summarize some of the top findings from this year's report. So Paul, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Eric, and my welcome to this virtual launch of the 2020 Kearney Foreign Direct Investment Confidence Index release. I am delighted, as well as Eric has noted, that Nancy and Sarah are with us, and thank them for their time and insights. When we first launched the FDI Confidence Index in 1998, as Eric said, it was pretty much the first of its kind in terms of providing a forward-looking assessment of FDI flows and likely FDI flows. This annual report, it's important to note, is a survey of global business executives, global 1,000 business executives who play a decisive role in FDI decision-making for their companies. This is not A.T. Kearney's judgment. It's the judgment of the people who make decisions with respect to FDI. Rather than focusing on historical data, this survey of global investors is designed to examine company FDI intentions, as well as broader FDI trends that are likely to affect flows over the course of the next 1 to 3 years. We continue to believe it's one of a kind, providing this kind of insight and vision, peripheral vision, in helping to identify broader issues that are affecting FDI decision-making. whether it's geopolitics, technology, socioeconomics, etc. The survey also, it's important to note, has a pretty strong track record of identifying not only the most attractive FDI destinations, but also overall macroeconomic and business conditions that are just emerging at the time of the survey and oftentimes become apparent as the years evolve and the survey data is demonstrated in reality. It's also important to note that the survey timeline for this morning's results doesn't pick up any of the recent social upheaval in the United States, or for that matter, around the world, or potential change in perception of the U.S. Domestically or abroad as a result of ongoing socio-political turmoil that is being experienced. So if we could move to slide 2. Before highlighting and turning the stage back over to Eric Peterson and our guests, I want to just spend a little bit of time going over the country rankings in this year's index and share with you some of the broader insights about macroeconomic and investment trends that emerged from this year's survey results. The 2020 index is titled Entering the Storm, Anticipating Risk in an Uncertain World. And the reasons for this obviously are apparent and will become even more apparent as we share these results this morning. So on slide 3, we have here an indication of what we're going to cover. We have the index rankings that we'll discuss first. And in those rankings, the U.S. again tops the FDI Confidence Index, holding its first place position for the 8th year in a row. The U.S. retook the top position after the release of the index in 1998, back in 2013, during what was then the Obama administration, as a result of investor perception of pretty strong fundamentals and prospects for the U.S. And here you see the results. The top 5 markets for FDI intentions are again, as last year, developed markets, a phenomenon that was apparent last year for the first time. Canada, you will see, rises to retake second place as Germany falls into third place position. Japan jumps to fourth place. France maintains its 5th position in the survey. And importantly, the top 10 countries on the index remain unchanged from last year, with the exception of Switzerland, which has displaced Singapore among the top 10. Next slide, please. European markets dominate this year's index results as well. You'll see continued investor focus on European markets, likely that stems from overall perception of friendly regulatory environments, in addition to skilled workforces, advanced infrastructure, and economic stability, which is a key trend you'll see on slide 6 that is in the index as well. Stronger investor interest in Asia-Pacific markets. However, it's notable that China slips to the 8th position, its lowest ever ranking in the history of the FDI Confidence Index. On slide 7, we see a notable trend in the rankings that we also saw last year, and that is investors' strong confidence in developed markets. With developed markets here on this slide accounting for 22 of the top 25 spots on the index. On the next slide, you'll see that it's important to say a few words, I think, about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the index results this year. And I want to stress a few key points in particular. On slide 9, you'll see that the first is regarding the survey timeline. we launched the survey in early February. And over the course of 6 weeks that the survey was in the field, the global environment obviously changed pretty dramatically, and a new world had begun emerging by the beginning of March as a result of the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on this timeline, a key conclusion also emerged, and our results suggest that investors only started to realize that the global economy was in free fall in the last days of our data collection in the field. So on slide 10 is our observation that at the beginning of the survey period, when we were in the field, business leaders were reasonably bullish about the global economy. In fact, more investors said that they were more optimistic about the coming year than they were the previous year. However, as they realized that we were entering this pandemic storm, as we call it, in the last weeks of the survey, investor confidence somewhat predictably declined across the board for developed, emerging, and frontier markets alike. On the next slide, slide 11, we see that in the last 2 weeks of the survey, investors told us that a potential economic crisis in a developed market was their biggest concern. And this number rose dramatically from just 26%, as you can see on this slide, in the first 2 weeks of the survey to 41% by the last 2 weeks that we were in the field with the survey instrument. On slide 12, we note that investor confidence also faded for all regions except for Europe and Eurasia over the course of our survey, though not as dramatically as one might think, given the extent of the COVID crisis that was confronting the global economy, or at least certainly coming into clearer focus by the conclusion of our field work. On slide 13, we note that in spite of the looming crisis, if we could move to slide 13, investor optimism about the global economy rose significantly this year, maintaining high levels throughout the 6 weeks that the survey was in the field. And this may suggest that investors were anticipating a rapid recovery from COVID-19, or perhaps more likely underestimating the risks that the pandemic would have and would pose to the global economy. So on slide 14, we note that half of investors told us that they're seeking new investments, and more than 80% told us that they expected an increase in their FDI in the coming 3 years, a figure, frankly, which didn't change significantly over the 6 weeks that we were conducting this survey. Indeed, intentions to increase FDI fell by only a modest 11 percentage points from February to March, from 87% to 76%. On the next slide, slide 15, we indicate that this optimism doesn't reflect the broader macroeconomic trends that are likely to play out in the near and medium term. The nature and timeline of FDI recovery remain highly uncertain, to be sure, but the quick downward spiral of the global economy since March will have profound negative implications, in our view, for FDI flows that will markedly diverge from the positive investment intentions expressed in these survey results. We expect that foreign direct investment will plummet, and that the negative effects of COVID-19 on the investment environment are likely to be acute and long-lasting. And all of this is happening in the context of perhaps the biggest strategic rethink of global supply chains, global value chains generally, and of the role of FDI in the last 30 years. So if you will, this is somewhat of a pre-existing condition of this rethink of global supply chains that is given added fuel by COVID-19. Drivers of this process include, of course, cross-border friction, as we've seen in trade frictions, nationalism, domestic procurement directives, as well as product customization and personalization, where consumers are demanding more personalization closer to the end user in the marketplace. And then, of course, technology innovations that lead to reduced production costs, and all of this is clearly diminishing the importance and traditional importance of labor arbitrage to generating FDI flows, along with the fear of these external shocks, which would cause supply chain interruptions, whether it's 9/11, COVID-19, or any other benign or pernicious shocks possible to the system. So this strategic reassessment, in our view, is going to have a significant impact on the availability of funds and the role of FDI. The next slide shows that investors only started to realize that the global economy was in free fall at the last moment. Implementing clearly then strategic foresight tools and improved planning strategies, we think, are extraordinarily important in order to better predict and plan for these shocks to the system that will continue to manifest themselves. And while there's no single playbook, of course, to manage a crisis, the general strategies of scenario and contingency planning and soliciting expert advice, simulation, and wargaming are clearly tools that need to be used. And we've seen from previous surveys that increasingly corporate players are using these tools with good effect. Now, on slide 17, we note that when we started designing this survey at the end of 2019, we wanted to understand how and if investors are factoring climate change into their investment decision-making. Each year, we try and look at a special issue in addition to FDI flows to understand how that issue is playing on impacting FDI. And since the rapid spread of COVID-19, climate change has been somewhat forced out of the global spotlight. However, this thematic discussion of climate change, we think, provides a snapshot of investor attitudes toward this important issue before the COVID-19 had fully engulfed the world. And we believe, and the next slide, that our findings are indeed striking, with 77% of investors telling us that climate-related risks are likely to affect their investment decision-making over the next 3 years, and 60% anticipate that financial losses will result from climate change over the medium term. On slide 19, we note that climate change risks represent a threat to the FDI assets of a majority of investors and is a consideration for a majority of those investors, and most of them believe it will result in financial losses. This level of awareness of climate change and the risks associated with climate change presents, we think, an important insight, and especially for those who are hoping that the private sector will actively begin addressing climate change issues in their own best interest. On slide 20, we note that, unsurprisingly, over the next 3 years, climate change then will be a factor in the calculus of investment decision-making for a majority, 77% of investors, and nearly half of investors indicate that this is likely or highly likely to be a factor in their decision-making. The next slide, slide 21, notes that investors in all regions rank extreme temperature change as the biggest climate risk today and over the next 3 years for their FDI assets. And the second biggest climate change risk currently facing investors is wildfires, and the third being drought and water shortages, as is noted on this slide. On slide 22, we can see that nearly 4/5, 79% of investors anticipate climate regulations will impact their investment decisions over the next 3 years. And on the following slide, slide 23, we note that 60% of investors anticipate climate change-related financial losses over the next 3 years. So, unsurprisingly, again, on slide 24, a striking 86% of investors state that the environmental impact of potential FDI targets is an increasingly important factor in their investment decision-making. So with that very quick flyby of this year's results, I want to turn the floor back over to my colleague, Eric Peterson, the head of the Global Business Policy Council, to lead the discussion with our distinguished guests. Eric?
Thank you, Paul, for that excellent overview. You raised a number of critical issues, and others will come out during the discussion with our experts now. And judging by the number of very good questions that have come in, there's no doubt that we'll have a very rich discussion, but please keep those questions coming. Let me remind you, please, that the chat feature on this WebEx is one vehicle for you to do that. Another is to send an email to gbpc@kearney.com. So with that, it's my pleasure to move us then into a more general discussion of the implications of these results. Paul will be joining us here as well, but it's also my distinct pleasure to introduce two outstanding individuals with strong reputations who are friends of our council. Nancy McLernan is President and CEO of the Global Business Alliance, an association representing the unique interests of U.S. subsidiaries of global companies. She is a recognized expert on cross-border investment trends, related legislative initiatives, long-standing friend of our council, and well-respected across the board. Sarah Ladislaw is Senior Vice President and Director and Senior Fellow at the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS, where she leads work not only in energy policy, but energy market issues, technology analysis, a big flow of intellectual capital. She's an expert in U.S. energy policy, global oil and natural gas markets, and she has a very strong set of credentials with respect to the nexus between energy on the one hand and climate change on the other. So I'd like to kick things off by asking our two friends here a few questions, and I hope that they'll use these questions to tee off on the points that they believe are most significant with respect to our FDICI results this year, after which we'll move into general discussion. So, Nancy, if I could begin with you, please. As Paul mentioned, the U.S. is at the top of the list again this year, 8th year in a row, a position that it's held since 2011. By my count, that's 3 administrations and administrations on both sides of the political aisle. To what extent do you think the effects of COVID-19 will affect FDI flows into the United States in the near and medium term? And then what are the other big factors at play as well?
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you also, Paul. Appreciate being asked to be a part of this unveil of your index again this year. as Eric mentioned, I'm with the Global Business Alliance. Folks may remember us as the Organization for International Investment, which we were for 30 years, and we've just rebranded ourselves. We are a trade association based in Washington, D.C., representing about 200 American companies with global heritage. And we like to think of ourselves as the voice of foreign direct investment in the United States. Our mission overall, as you touched on, Eric, is to promote and defend an open economy which provides the greatest job opportunities for Americans. And our members are among the largest foreign companies in the United States. So about 60% of all foreign companies in the U.S. Employ about 1,000 people here. Our members employ on average about 12,000 people. So these are companies like Samsung and Toyota and Nestle and Sanofi and Siemens. So our membership, which can be found at globalbusiness.org, are of those larger foreign companies in the United States. And your index is really important because I think it helps multinational companies determine what is best strategy for cross-border investment. And it's important because FDI itself is important. So if I could just take a moment and give a little bit of details about what FDI brings just to the U.S. economy. So before the pandemic, international companies in the United States employed about 7.4 million workers. On average, these companies paid about 26% higher compensation than the business community overall. And foreign direct investment in the U.S. and in many countries is heavily concentrated in the manufacturing sector. So about 20% of all manufacturing jobs are at international companies. And sort of a gee whiz fact is that over the last 5 years, 61% of all new manufacturing jobs in the U.S. were created at international companies. These companies bring resiliency to the economy, and it helps other countries have a stake in U.S. economic success. So the FDI index and FDI in general is very important to any economy. So in looking at how COVID is going to have an impact, you may know that UNCTAD, which does a release every year on their expectation as well on FDI flows, did an update of their regular annual numbers at the end of March, which showed that they're expecting FDI across the globe to decrease by about 30 to 40% in 2020 alone. Obviously, so many companies are trying to figure out the way forward. So just estimating in 2020, about 30 to 40% down. UNCTAD also looked at how countries were responding to COVID, and many countries were easing regulations, making it more available for companies to invest in their country, incentivizing that cross-border investment. But other countries, many developed countries, were actually tightening reviews of foreign direct investment and raising barriers in that name of nationalism, economic security, as some policymakers saw it. Our organization did a survey in April, so through the month of April, so we were right in the midst of all of the different slowdowns, and about 77% of our members felt that the U.S. itself was going to get more protectionist as a result of COVID-19. 60% of GBA members said that the U.S. business climate for international companies is getting worse compared to 6 months ago. So definitely reacting to what was going on in the midst of the pandemic. That's the lowest level since 2010, and it marks a 45-point slide from the spring of 2018, right after U.S. Tax reform. So definitely significant. And so countries that embrace opening their markets to foreign direct investment, especially at a time where FDI is falling, are going to be more successful. But your index shows the U.S. certainly has remained high, the U.S. remains a good place to do business. If we could just somehow get policymakers sometimes out of the way to allow some of this cross-border investment and reducing tensions between countries, I think that all would see that FDI coming back up.
Thank you, Nancy. And when we think about a whole range of other factors influencing the considerations of companies to continue their enthusiasm for the U.S. economy, what other major factors would you highlight?
Well, again, global companies tend to be fairly resilient because they have the ability to mobilize and move capital across borders. And that resiliency is really important. When we asked our companies again in the April survey how long they thought it would take to recover, they averaged about 14 months to recover, which is a full 57% faster than they think the U.S. economy as a whole will recover. So they believe that those companies will recover in 14 months, the U.S. economy will take 22 months, and then the global economy overall will take about 27 months. So, these companies were in some respect already planning for the economic downturn. Last year, when we met with our CEOs and CFOs, these are the U.S. Top executives at our companies, they were already preparing for an economic downturn. So perhaps they were a little bit more prepared for some of this. When asking them again in April if they planned on changing their strategy, asking them about supply chains, because that has become such a political issue in the United States and sort of the reaction and response to COVID, 30% at the time said that they were going to actually further diversify their supply chains. 15% said they were going to become less reliant on China, which I found interesting. And 2 in 5 expect that there's going to be more corporate consolidation. So that M&A environment is going to be really, really important.
Thank you, Nancy. Let's shift to Sarah now, and then we'll come back. I'm on the receiving end of a torrent of good questions here, and I look forward to hearing what you all think about these. Sarah, great to have you with us. This is Sarah's first time as joining us in the FDICI rollout. Nancy's a veteran, but we're delighted also to welcome you, Sarah. You heard from Paul that we devoted a special section of the FDICI to climate change and its implications. He mentioned, among other things, that one of the effects of the COVID-19 phenomenon is to push climate change somewhat out of the spotlight. The question is, do you think that public and political focus will shift back to climate change soon, or is it really just, is it in a different manifestation right now? What is your perspective on this?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me, and it's a very interesting report. I'd not read it before, but I thought particularly the timing of it and your observation about how investors were thinking from the beginning part of your survey to the end part of your survey was actually pretty interesting. I mean, we're looking a lot at a fairly precipitous drop in investing that's going on in the energy sector. And what's been interesting to me is that the learning process for investors over the course of this COVID-19 economic downturn continues. I was really shocked to see how very many economic prognosticators have a very bullish view at the end of the year for this year and persisted to have that view even as the economy was going into lockdown, with most of the sort of epidemiological analysis saying that the end of the year was going to be worse than that could potentially be worse in terms of the virus lockdown. So I think, this idea of how investors interpret and sort of get off their back footing in terms of thinking about economic downturn is a situation we continue to watch on the energy side of the ledger. I will say, I didn't find the climate change portions to be too surprising. I think somewhere in the report you remarked that the World Economic Forum, if you looked at what they had put out at the beginning of the year, there was a huge amount of focus on the environment and climate change. And part of that is just for this particular group that you're surveying, they've been asked to pay more attention, right? I mean, this is the tail end of a phenomenon where awareness of climate risk in their portfolios and their investments is something that everybody's asking for, from central banks to regulators to other investors to asset managers. Everybody's being asked to pay more attention to where climate risk exists in their portfolio. And so I think a lot of the responses that you saw in your survey is certainly part and parcel of that conversation. I do think, climate change is one of those issues where it suffers from the same dynamics that a pandemic does. When you're thinking about it, it's front of mind, it's impactful to everything. And when you're not, it kind of can recede to the background. And so I do think, obviously there's going to be a lot of focus on climate change continuing within the investor sector, particularly because of the stance that the European central banks are taking on trying to stress test different banking sectors. I think, just the question now in the United States and Europe and China and Korea and other places that have been taking a look at, what kind of resilience lessons have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic response? How does that inform our responses to things like climate change? And a lot of folks that I'm speaking with are sort of coupling together this idea of supply chain resilience and domestic reliance with COVID-19, with national security, and with climate change to basically use this, as Nancy was saying, sort of to bolster messages about thinking about the ways in which reliance on other countries, both for investment and for supply chains, can be a source of instability. Now, I will say, if you think about the after effects from the 2008-2009 financial crisis and the economic downturn, there were a lot of reforms that came out of that process, and some of them, certainly helped people assess their financial risk in better ways, but they didn't necessarily lead to long-term changes, right? They didn't necessarily lead to long-term reforms that potentially would sort of, completely alleviate those conditions. I think we have to think about this period of time as the same thing, which is there's a lot of people talking about the types of things that will make their supply chains more resilient for a variety of reasons. But I think it's hard to actually sustain some of those things if there's a cost to them, if there's a inconvenience to them in a way, and they're not backed by strong regulation. So I think it is very hard for us to say what kind of things across the board are durable impacts from this downturn and will lead to sort of more permanent impacts or changes going forward. On the explicit question about, climate change and whether or not we're going to, focus on it again, we have to remember we are going into hurricane and wildfire season. Nature doesn't really care so much about how overwhelmed we feel at this point. And so I think we will see a resurgence in that conversation. And I think depending on where you are, as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, there is a lot of focus on trying to think about building back better. And in Europe and other places, there's a big focus on what that means for climate change and climate investment. So I do think that you'll see a resurgence in that topic relative to what you're seeing right now.
Sarah, on that point about building back better, a number of the questions that are scrolling across my screen right now are asking the question about how environmental issues are being built in national recovery strategies. And then there are also a number of questions about what are the implications of the financing of those strategies, those stimulus programs across the board. But maybe we could parse this up and ask you, Sarah, to talk about kind of the environmental dimension of that. And Nancy, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this, but it'd be interesting to get your perspective on the broader overhang that is implied by a number of these very substantial debt and other obligations that are taken on as part of the stimulus packages. So, Sarah, could we begin with you, please?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think, people, the default response here in having just gone through an economic downturn a decade ago was to think that there would be a green stimulus effort on par with what we saw in 2008 and 2009. And so far what we've seen is countries and locations that already had an intent to decarbonize their energy system, or to, the Green Deal in Europe or in places like Korea, where they already had plans in place. This was an easier decision for them to decide that there would be a structured effort to build back better. They had structures in place, they had regulations in place. They're not done deals by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly it was an architecture through which to funnel stimulus funding. I think what you're seeing in the United States and China are a little bit different. China, because they're not willing to take on a package that's quite as large as they did once before, they're in a different place than they were. That's not to say that they're not going to still invest in things that advance some of their science and technology and China 2025 strategic objectives. I think they will still do that, but they're just not quite as inclined to spend as heavily as they did in the wake of 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. And so in the United States, it's a completely different issue, which is we've spent mightily in terms of what I call stability-oriented stimulus, which is essentially keeping the economy in a state of suspended animation and trying to make sure that, when we can go back to work, that things aren't bankrupt and the economy isn't completely locked up. We haven't really gotten to the conversation in earnest about in which direction would we like to build back. And unfortunately, there's just so many fundamental disagreements in the U.S. political system, even on things we agree on, like infrastructure. So if you look at the transportation surface bill or the infrastructure bills that are being proposed in the United States as potential vehicles for additional stimulus, for rebuilding type stimulus, there's just a lot of disagreements about what should actually go in there, what should the role of government be. We're watching very carefully, how much government intervention in stimulus and recovery packages actually transfers ownership or control through the government to different sectors of the economy. And again, if you're like me, unfortunately a bit pessimistic, I don't actually think we're at the end of this economic downturn. We may just be sort of in the quiet middle of it. If we get to a point where we need to do additional stimulus in the fall or additional stimulus in the spring, depending on how the fall and winter goes, you have to genuinely ask yourself a question: how much do governments want to spend before putting conditions on sectors of the economy that they want to take over? And in places where they're thinking about reorienting their economy to something approximating net zero, there's going to be a huge focus on regulation and on directing those investments to things that build back better. And here's where the United States, who is probably in the best position to spend a lot of money, is really the question. If you have a change in the election, in a change in the administration as a result of the election, you could see a huge amount of green-oriented stimulus coming out of a campaign like the Biden administration. So lots of questions there still, but definitely different approaches in different parts of the world.
Thank you. Nancy, a number of the questions that have been kindly sent in by participants in this call focus on the whole notion of self-sufficiency in the context of COVID. We've seen a lot of this talk, and you mentioned earlier about that your survey had shown that prospects for a more internally focused attitude with respect to investment flows had increased. And that tracks with a number of anecdotal things that we're picking up in the GVPC. But when we think about this overall emphasis in stimulus packages and what that implies in terms of debt overhang and a range of other factors. How do you see all that playing out?
Yeah, so first, I did want to remark on the climate change conversation. So, our members have been increasing their focus on climate change issues. From your survey results, certainly shows that there is a cost to climate change. So regardless of what governments do, businesses certainly that can afford to are taking steps in which to deal with it because it's hitting their bottom line. Also, the effort to be good corporate citizens, but it's hitting their bottom line. So our members have historically had really good or have been leaders in terms of product carbon emissions. And obviously there's enormous work ahead, but I do see it remaining a priority for corporations, if for no other reason, is because that it is having an impact on them. But I know that our member companies, their leaders, feel that they need to step out and show some strong leadership for other companies in this space. In terms of how I view our companies and needing stimulus and supply chains, clearly, I agree with Sarah. I think that we are kind of in the quiet middle. The estimations that we're going to bounce back in Q3 and Q4, I think, are very, very optimistic because we just don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic. We did a survey just last week asking our companies when they're going to feel okay being in meetings, external meetings with people of more than 10. There's still a lot of concern about doing that. And until we get through the health crisis, it's going to be really difficult to determine what comes next in terms of stimulus, right? So focusing on getting us through the health crisis, obviously, is first and foremost. From talking to our company, dealing with the health crisis as well as the subsequent economic one is best done through strengthening our global connections with our allies, not weakening them. So while some countries, and certainly we've heard this in the United States from politicians here, have increased calls for nationalism and consolidating to ensure for better pandemic preparedness at a later date, our members actually think the better way to do that is by strengthening those global connections with our allies and diversifying further. And so I expect that that's a direction that companies will want to go. And I think that if we work in concert with our allied nations, that we'll be able to be weathering the economic downturn as well as the health crisis.
Thank you. Paul, let's get you involved in this discussion. A number of the questions and comments that are coming in focus, as you might expect, on another key variable that we all need to take into account, the one that we haven't discussed too much yet, but you raised in your comments in terms of timing of our results, and that is the trajectory of Sino-American relations. We've seen a lot of trade issues develop, and now there are a number of other tariff and non-tariff barriers as well that are existing and under consideration, as well as other issues. How do you see all this playing out, effect on investment direction and flows in some of the other issues that have been raised?
Well, obviously, the Sino-U.S. trade relationship is the big one in focus and the one that is under the most tension these days. And as people are thinking already about reorganizing their supply chains with global supply chain reorganization, obviously looking at China and whether or not China will be a reliable, continue to be a reliable source of product and supply for global supply chains is an extraordinarily important condition to consider. And as I said in my remarks, the reorganization of global supply chains was a pre-existing condition before COVID-19. The shocks that the system has experienced over the years, both benign and less so in terms of supply chain interruptions and costs, had already pre-COVID-19 forced many companies to rethink what they need to produce and at what cost in their supply chain. I think that U.S.-Chinese trade frictions is just one more factor, along with what we had already seen is the rise of nationalism, national procurement schemes, questions that have to do with technology that no longer requires you to have low-cost manufacturing at a distant location. And then, of course, questions about customization and personalization of product, where consumers are requiring more personalization close to the end user. All of that makes for shorter supply chain requirements that put at risk China as a manufacturing platform for the rest of the world. So I think Sino-U.S. trade relations is just one more sort of background noise in a picture that is changing rather dramatically and will change much more dramatically as a result of COVID-19.
Thank you. We have a question here that I think all three of you will have good insight on. What industries, we are asked, do you expect to be hardest hit after the decline in FDI flows? And the question is, will companies, as a result of this, be incentivized to move into automation or high technology, or what kinds of strategies might ensue? Sarah, could we start with you on this? I know that you've kind of traversed sectors in terms of your expertise. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think the first and most honest response is we don't know yet. So far what we've seen is how many people can weather the storm right now. So if you look just say at the oil and gas industry, an industry that has been experiencing a lot of changes, for lack of a much more complicated discussion, over the last last decade or so. We're going to see a huge number of bankruptcies, here in the United States in terms of, smaller oil and gas companies that just don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to weather a downturn like this. For some of the larger companies, the big question is, if the downturn persists and investor confidence in investing in, say, a sector like the U.S. onshore oil and gas sector declines, then they might have a hard time being able to weather a continued economic downturn if it lasts, well into next year. And I think people might be surprised by things like that. I mean, I think this idea, the question I get the most is, are we still going to see these companies that have made, very ambitious pledges about transitioning into low carbon companies? Are they going to be able to do that still? And it's a very hard thing to do, to talk about changing your business model while you're at the same time just trying to survive what has been the third, collapse in oil prices over a very short, period of time. And so I do think that that we've seen a huge number of impacts on the energy sector. We've seen a lot of impacts in terms of joblessness in the renewable energy sector as well. Again, what's going to determine whether those things stick or not is whether or not the economy turns around in the fall, and how much we can see in terms of additional support for some of those industries. So again, I think it's a little hard to tell what things are temporary versus permanent, at least as far as it goes in the energy sector.
That's fair. Nancy, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Sarah. Obviously, very, very early to be able to make any sort of estimation on what could happen. Foreign direct investment in the United States is concentrated in the manufacturing sector. So if FDI is going to go down 30 to 40%, we certainly would expect that the manufacturing sector is going to take a big hit in that. Although some of our companies really sort of changed their production of things to deal with the pandemic. So you had Honda making 3D face masks. You had Pernod Ricard, a beverage company, start making hand sanitizers. Because we're still sort of in the midst of the health crisis, it really is hard to sort of make it out through the end of the year. But without a doubt, what will have an impact are countries' policies toward cross-border investment, right? So if you see a continued rise in nationalism, a focus on protecting the industrial base as defined by sort of who is us, where a company is headquartered, that's going to have an even greater impact.
Good. Paul, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, from our survey results, we know that investors in IT appear to be those most likely to invest. And it's no surprise, given the importance of technology, high tech, to the transition that we're going through economically as people are sidelined and forced to work from home. So investors in IT appear the most likely to invest. And secondly, investors in services, and then finally in industry. And we also know from the survey that investors in IT gave the highest scores to the United States as providing the best IT investment environment. And investors in industry gave the highest score to Germany, for example. And investors in the services sector, again, gave the United States the highest score, which is why the U.S. is still at the top of the rankings.
Thanks, Paul. There is one question that has come up repeatedly, but we need a short answer to this. Paul, I'd be grateful if you could take this one on. It concerns China's ranking on the index. And the question is, there's been a decline in the position. What explains it? You've already mentioned something about the timing and the COVID phenomenon, and but would you like to add anything else to that?
Well, I think, again, China's drop predates COVID-19. We saw it last year, and in fact, we saw it back in 2013 when the U.S. overtook China as the leading destination for FDI, the most attractive destination for FDI. And I think it's really a combination of things, not just Sino-U.S. trade friction, but really, much more importantly, the reassessment of global supply chains and the decreased importance of finding low-cost manufacturing, sources for plant development and supplying product across a global supply chain, and this notion of the inherent risk associated with long, extended supply chains. All that militates against China's position and is reflected in the results.
Thank you. Look, a lot of great questions still on the table, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our time. Let me conclude here by extending sincerest thanks to Nancy, to Sarah for being with us this year, as well, of course, to our Chairman Emeritus, Paul Laudicina, who launched this whole thing way back when in 1998. I'd also like to thank the architects of the event within our own Global Business Policy Council, Allison McDougall, Emily Hazard, and the research leads in preparing this year's index, Terry Toland, Radina Belbarova, Gabriela Hudart, and Rebecca Grenham. As a reminder, this session will be available online on Kearney's website. That's kearney.com. In addition, a copy of this report will now be emailed to all of you. So across the world, thank you so very much for joining us here today. This is a rapidly evolving situation, and we've been very pleased to provide this snapshot of where things are with respect to foreign direct investment trends. Thank you so much for joining us.